Welcome to Save Point AFK. This is the history of Leyndell, the royal capital. Chapter 1: The birth of the capital. There are few places in the lands between whose name alone still carries the weight of divinity. Leyndell, the royal capital, the heart of the Golden Order, and once the gleaming cradle of civilization beneath the Erdtree's shadow. To walk its streets was to walk in the light of the divine, and to hear its bells was to hear the pulse of the world itself. Yet, as with all things born from faith and conquest alike, its story begins not with peace, but with purpose. And purpose, in the hands of gods, is rarely gentle. Long before the first gold leaf adorned its towering walls, before marble and rune fused into perfect form, the lands that would one day cradle Leyndell were nothing more than open plains, the basin at the roots of an immense and ancient tree. The Erdtree itself had not yet become the beacon of life it would one day be. In that age, it stood as a divine promise waiting to be realized, a living monument to the greater will, the unknowable cosmic power that had turned its gaze upon the lands between. It was in this sacred basin that Queen Marika the Eternal made her covenant. The greater will sent unto her its messenger, the Elden Beast, a being of radiant order whose golden form was a reflection of the Erdtree's yet unblossomed splendor. From this divine communion, the foundations of the Golden Order were set in motion, and the place where the Erdtree cast its longest shadow would become the center of all things. Marika's first act was to sanctify the land beneath the tree. Her followers, awed by the Erdtree's light, erected primitive temples of stone and wood, each engraved with symbols that would one day become the first runes of order. But these were not yet the great spires we know today. These were humble beginnings, carved by hand and faith alone. The Erdtree's light nourished the soil, and the soil, in turn, grew the seeds of civilization. Marika's next act was to unite the disparate tribes that roamed the surrounding lands. Humanity in that era was fractured. Warriors, mystics, and hunters who each followed their own gods. The Age of Chaos, it was later called. Each tribe bowed to a different flame, a different spirit, and the gods themselves quarreled endlessly above them. To bring order to this discord, Marika offered them the light of the Erdtree, a promise of unity beneath one law, the Golden Order. It was not a promise that came without blood. The tribes that refused to kneel were struck down by Marika's champions, the Crucible Knights, who wielded the first golden incantations drawn from the Erdtree's sap. They were the prototypes of a new kind of divinity, men and women whose devotion was rewarded not through birthright, but through transformation. They bore the marks of the crucible upon their bodies, wings, horns, scales, remnants of the primordial chaos that existed before the Erdtree's perfection. To the faithful, these traits were blessings. To the unfaithful, they were horrors. Yet through these nights, the land was subdued, and the seeds of Leyndell's dominion were sown. As the years passed, the primitive temples gave way to great terraces of polished white stone. Roads of rune-etched brick spread like veins from the Erdtree's roots, radiating outward to connect distant lands. These were the first arteries of the empire, paths of pilgrimage, built not for commerce, but for worship. Every brick was laid with ritual, every gate aligned with the stars, for Leyndell was never merely meant to be a city. It was meant to be a symbol of divine geometry, the earthly reflection of the order that governed the cosmos. In this early era, Marika still walked among her people. She was not yet the distant goddess she would one day become, sealed behind marble and myth. She spoke to priests, comforted soldiers, and stood at the very center of the growing city, her hand resting upon the bark of the Erdtree. The people called her the Radiant Mother, and her word was law. Around her gathered the first scholars of the order, the Golden Priests, who began to record the will of the gods in script. These writings would evolve into the Golden Law, a doctrine that sought to describe every phenomenon, every life and death, through the lens of the Erdtree's grace. But a city born from faith must also be sustained by strength. And so Marika called upon her consort, the man history would know as Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. Godfrey's armies marched beneath banners of sun, gold, and white, and where they went, the lands were cleansed of heresy. His warriors carried relics of the Erdtree, sap crystals that blazed with holy fire, and their victories brought new souls to the capital. The conquered tribes were not all slaughtered. Many were brought within Leyndell's walls to labor, to build, and to worship. The city's foundation stones were laid not only in gold, but in sweat and submission. The earliest architects of Leyndell believed the city must be built in concentric layers, a reflection of the Elden Ring itself. Each layer represented a different principle of order: faith, law, life, and death, circling outward from the Erdtree's base. The innermost sanctum, closest to the divine, was reserved for Marika's kin and the highest clergy. Beyond it spread the noble districts, their marble homes adorned with statues of dragons bound in chains, a reminder of the enemies subdued in the name of order. Further still were the outer rings, where common folk dwelled, their streets winding like veins through the golden sprawl. It was said that as the Erdtree grew, so too did the city. Its roots delved into the bedrock beneath, merging with the very foundations of the capital. The air itself shimmered with grace. Those who lived within Leyndell for long enough began to take on a faint golden hue to their hair and eyes, a subtle mark of the Erdtree's favor. Priests called it a sign of the soul's sanctification. Skeptics whispered it was a hint of the order's corruption. In these years, the golden crucible of faith dominated worship. Before the pure golden order doctrine was codified, People revered the Erdtree's primordial aspect, the crucible, when all life was still one, before form and law divided creation. Temples depicted in the Erdtree's roots, wrapping around dragons and beasts, absorbing them into a single divine body. Priests bathed in its sap, seeking to transcend the boundaries between man and God. Yet Marika, ever aware of the dangers of unrestrained faith, began to suppress this older cult. The Crucible Knights were slowly phased out, their forms seen less as divine and more as aberrant. The Order would define perfection through purity, and purity could not abide mutation. Thus began the Great Purging of the Crucible, one of the earliest dark chapters in the city's history. Knights who had once fought for Marika found themselves exiled, their faith deemed impure. Some fled to the outskirts of the capital, carving new lives among the ruins and caves. Others hid their deformities beneath golden armor and swore new oaths to serve in silence. Yet even in exile, their devotion to the Erdtree never waned, and centuries later, remnants of the Crucible faith would still be found in secret catacombs beneath Leyndell's streets. By the time the first golden spires touched the clouds, Leyndell had become more than a capital. It had become the heart of the world. The Erdtree's light poured through every street, casting perpetual day upon its walls. Statues of Marika and Godfrey lined the boulevards, each depicting them in divine triumph. The people believed that as long as Leyndell stood, so too would the Order endure. And for a time, it did. Peace settled across the lands between. The wars ceased, the tribes were united, and trade flowed through golden gates. Scholars gathered to study the runes of the Erdtree. Artisans forged relics infused with grace, and prophets spoke of an age that would never end. The very air was heavy with faith, and faith, when absolute, breeds blindness. Those who questioned the Order's perfection were quietly removed. The streets gleamed, but beneath the gold lay silence. The capital had become a paradise, yes, but a paradise that allowed no shadow. And all that was imperfect was cast out, and all that was left was gilded stillness. In the sanctum of the city, Marika gazed upon her creation and felt both pride and unease. She had built a world in which every law was divine, every breath sanctioned by grace. But she also sensed the cost, for beneath the perfection of Leyndell's walls, humanity's spirit began to dull. The flame of struggle, of discovery, of freedom, all were fading in the light of the Erdtree. And so the seeds of doubt were sown, not among mortals, but within the heart of a god. Chapter 2. Godfrey, the First Elden Lord. When the world was still young, beneath the Erdtree's glow, there came a man who bore its light upon his blade. His name was Hora Lu, though history would remember him by another, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. In the beginning, he was not of divine birth, nor chosen by fate. He was a warrior, a conqueror whose strength was as pure and unrelenting as the earth itself. He fought for no god, no creed, only the thrill of battle. Yet it was this very purity of strength, untempted by faith or ambition, that drew Queen Marika's gaze. For in his might, she saw the vessel through which order could be spread. Their meeting would mark the true beginning of the Age of the Erdtree, where Marika embodied divinity, Godfrey embodied resolve. Together, they would forge a new kind of power, a union between faith and war. It is said that when Marika anointed him as her consort, the Erdtree itself trembled in recognition. From that day forward, the golden light of grace flowed through his veins, marking him as the first of all champions to be touched by the divine. And in his hand, he bore the great axe, regalia of the Erdtree, a weapon said to channel the very radiance of order. With it, he would lead armies in conquest, subduing the wild lands beyond the capital's reach. In those days, Leyndell was still young, its foundations vast, but its reach untested. The lands beyond teemed with gods, dragons, and ancient powers that had no place in Marika's new vision. The greater will demanded unity, and Godfrey answered that call with war. He led the wars of expansion, bringing the Erdtree's light to distant corners of the lands between. His banners shone like suns over the blackened hills, and wherever his armies marched, gold followed. The giants of the mountaintops were the first to fall, once proud keepers of the flame that defied the Erdtree. They were hunted nearly to extinction. Their fire was snuffed out, and the snow-stained peaks became graveyards of frozen titans. To ensure their flame would never again challenge the Golden Order, Marika sealed it beneath divine law, the curse of the giants, the first great act of suppression under the Erdtree's rule. Then came the ancient dragons, whose lightning storms once scorched the very skies above the capital. Their scales shimmered with the primal power of the Crucible, that ancient chaotic life that predated the Erdtree's order. They resisted Godfrey's armies with unmatched fury. The war against them lasted for generations, a divine struggle between flame and lightning, between the old world and the new. In the end, victory came not through strength alone, but through something rarer, mercy. For when Godwyn the Golden, Godfrey and Marika's beloved son, faced the mighty dragon Fortisax, he did not slay the beast. He stayed his hand. The dragon, moved by this act, laid down its wrath, and from this strange kinship was born the dragon cult of Leyndell, warriors who sought to honor both god and dragon, to wield lightning in the service of the Erdtree rather than against it. The walls of Leyndell soon bore the carvings of their triumphs. Great reliefs depicted Godfrey astride his lion regent Serosh, standing over fallen giants and dragons alike. Each victory was sanctified in ceremony, each conquest enshrined as divine providence. The capital grew fat upon glory. Of all the symbols tied to Godfrey, none was more striking than Serosh, the great lion bound upon his back. In the days of conquest, Serosh was more than a mere companion. He was Godfrey's restraint. For Horalu, before he became Elden Lord, had been known for his bloodlust. His fury was the stuff of legend. He could tear through armies like storms through fields. Marika feared that such savagery, though mighty, would taint the sacred image of the Golden Order. And so, when she made him her consort, she bade Serosh to dwell upon his shoulders, to bind his wrath and temper his nature. It is said that from that day forward, Godfrey's roars ceased. His heart was still, his rage contained. He became the very image of discipline, a warrior made divine, yet deep within, the beast still stirred, its hunger unsated. The restraint that made him holy also made him hollow. Still, he obeyed, for Marika's vision was his law. He waged war in her name and built peace in her image. The city of Leyndell flourished beneath his reign, each victory feeding its myth. The nobles of the capital spoke of Godfrey as the hand of the Erdtree, its will given flesh. His generals became lords, his captains kings of vassal states. Through his conquest, the Golden Order extended its reach across every known land. Yet the longer he fought, the more he began to sense what Marika had already foreseen, that victory, once total, leaves no purpose behind. The royal family of the Golden Order began here, with Godfrey, Marika, and their children. Godwyn the Golden, their eldest, was the pride of the realm, his kindness as renowned as his courage. Beside him stood his half-siblings, Morgott and Mohg, twin-born as omens and cursed for it. Beneath the shining surface of the royal court, these children reflected the contradictions of the order itself, perfection and flaw, grace and exile. The people adored Godwyn. He was seen as the living embodiment of the Erdtree's light. When he walked through Leyndell's streets, garlands of gold were strewn at his feet. Statues of him were erected even before his death, for in the capital, prophecy and worship often blurred. But in the shadows beneath those same streets, Morgott and Mohg languished. Their birth as omens, beings marked by horns and deformity, was seen as a sign of impurity, of crucible blood that had no place in Marika's perfect world. Though born of divine lineage, they were shackled and banished to the depths beneath the capital, confined among the filth and the forgotten. Thus, from the very moment of triumph, Rot began to creep into the city's foundation, not of flesh, but of faith. The nobles turned a blind eye. The priests spoke only of light, and Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, ever dutiful, carried on the will of the divine, unaware of the growing cracks beneath his golden throne. In time, conquest gave way to peace. The enemies of the Erdtree were broken or subdued, and the capital stood unchallenged. The great walls of Leyndell gleamed brighter than ever before, their gates adorned with living runes that sang softly when touched by sunlight. The Erdtree's boughs hung above the city like a canopy of stars, dripping golden motes of grace that danced through the air. To breathe within Leyndell was to breathe divinity itself. The order flourished. Scholars studied the nature of life and death, of grace and decay. Smiths forged relics that hummed with divine resonance. Priests recorded Marika's sermons, turning her words into scripture. The two fingers, envoys of the greater will, established their temple at the very heart of the city, offering communion with the divine to those deemed worthy. To live in Leyndell was to dwell in perfection, or so the people believed. But perfection is a heavy weight to bear, and for Godfrey, the warrior who had lived his entire life through strife and conquest, peace became a prison. His axe grew cold, his lion slept, and as the years passed, the fire within him dimmed. The greater will does not tolerate stagnation. When purpose fades, grace withdraws. And so, when the age of conquest ended, the first Elden Lord found himself stripped of grace. He had fulfilled his purpose. His wars were done. His strength no longer needed. Marika, ever the vessel of the greater will, looked upon her husband with both sorrow and duty. "You have fought long and well," she told him, "but now you must go." And thus Godfrey was exiled from the lands between, not as punishment, but as promise. He was to wander as the first of the tarnished, a people forsaken yet destined to one day return when grace called them home. His departure marked the end of the capital's first golden age. When Godfrey and his warriors marched beyond the mist, the city wept. But beneath the mourning, there was relief, for Leyndell had outgrown its need for war. The age of peace had begun. Yet, unbeknownst to its people, the moment of their triumph was also the beginning of their undoing. For with Godfrey's departure, the bond between strength and faith was severed. And though the Erdtree still glowed bright above, the capital's light had begun to wane. In the wake of Godfrey's exile, Marika sat upon the throne alone, her gaze turned inward, to the order she had built, to the silence that now reigned in her husband's absence. She had forged a world of harmony, yet her heart was restless, for the Golden Order was not peace. It was stagnation, masked as divinity, and the gods, even divine ones, cannot abide stillness forever. The lion's roar was gone from the city, but in its place came whispers of Marika's new consort, Radagon, a red-haired champion who rose from the north, bearing the same face and soul as Marika herself. He would become her other half, both husband and self. Together, they would preside over the city's next era, one of introspection and law. But the warrior's age had ended. The light that once blazed through Leyndell's streets was now soft, diffused, eternal, and ever so slightly cold. The people called it the Age of Radiance, but radiance, as the Erdtree would one day teach them, is not always the same as life. Chapter 3: The Age of Radiance. There are ages when a city ceases to be a place and becomes an idea. When the weight of its faith and the reach of its power turn it into something more than mortal hands could ever truly build. For Leyndell, that moment came in what the scholars of later ages would call the Age of Radiance, a time when every stone gleamed with divine purpose, when the very air shimmered with the light of grace. It was the age of Marika and Radagon, two beings who were not two, and yet were. Two souls, or perhaps one, intertwined in divine mystery. Their union would define the shape of the Golden Order for all time. The Erdtree loomed above them, its trunk so vast it seemed to merge with the horizon. Its golden light poured down upon the capital like liquid dawn, flowing through spires, temples, and marble terraces until the entire city glowed. The Erdtree's presence was so absolute that day and night ceased to matter. In Leyndell, it was always morning. Leyndell's architects called themselves the Geomancers of Grace. They did not simply build, they listened. Every column, every street, every bridge of the city was constructed according to celestial alignment, in harmony with the sacred geometry of the Elden Ring. The streets radiated outward in concentric circles, mirroring the runes of order. Life, death, law, faith, time, and causality. To walk through Leyndell was to move through scripture itself. In the city's heart, directly beneath the Erdtree's trunk, stood the sanctified throne, the seat of Marika's divinity and Radagon's wisdom. The throne chamber was said to be carved out of living rootstone, the Erdtree's essence petrified into gold. The air there was warm and fragrant, filled with the hum of unseen power. It was not merely a throne room, it was the nexus of the world, where divine will and mortal reality met. All across the capital, great statues of Marika and Radagon towered over the boulevards. In some, they stood apart, Marika serene and timeless, Radagon stern and resolute. In others, they merged, two halves of one being, their forms blending like twin streams of molten light. To the faithful, it was a mystery too sacred to question. To the scholars, it was a revelation, proof that divinity could contain contradiction. The priests of the Golden Order spoke of this duality often. Marika was eternity, the unchanging law. Radagon was revision, the order that refines itself. Together, they represented the balance of perfection and imperfection, creation and correction. Their union was the philosophy of the Golden Order itself, that even divinity must improve upon itself to remain true. During this age, Leyndell became a paradise in truth. The Erdtree's light flowed through the air as motes of golden grace, each particle carrying life and warmth. The sick were healed merely by living in its glow. Crops grew without toil. Children were born with golden eyes, an unmistakable mark of divine favor. The city's outer walls expanded ever outward, enclosing more land, more temples, and more shrines. Every citizen, no matter how humble, could feel the Erdtree's blessing in their blood. Even death seemed softened. When the aged passed away, their bodies dissolved into dust of gold, returning to the tree that had given them life. No graves were needed, for the Erdtree took all souls back into itself. The priests called it the cycle of grace, a perfect law of return. Life, death, and rebirth all flowed through the Erdtree, unbroken. To die within Leyndell was to become eternal. Yet there was a quiet danger in such perfection. When life is so easily granted and death so easily undone, meaning begins to fade. The citizens of Leyndell grew serene, then complacent. They no longer feared failure or death. They no longer questioned purpose. Faith was not a choice, but a state of being. And while this contentment brought peace, it also dulled the soul. The philosophers of the age, the golden scholars, debated endlessly in the halls of the Conspectus of Order, a vast academy built near the Erdtree's roots. They studied the runes of life and law, seeking to perfect the formulas that governed the world. To them, creation was mathematics. The Erdtree was the equation, and the Elden Ring, the solution. The more they studied, the less they saw the world as alive, and the more they saw it as structure. A perfect, unchanging machine of divinity. This was the paradox of Leyndell, a city alive with holiness, but growing hollow within. As the priests sang hymns to eternal grace, the echoes rang against marble halls that no longer knew what it meant to strive. Despite its brilliance, the past was not so easily erased. Beneath the city, in catacombs and forgotten tunnels, the crucible faith endured. There, far below the light, ancient carvings depicted the primordial Erdtree, not the pure golden icon of Marika's age, but the crucible, where all forms of life were still intertwined. Beasts, dragons, serpents, and men shared one essence. It was chaos, sacred, wild, and real. To the devout followers of the new Golden Order, Such images were heresy. To the exiled Crucible Knights, they were memory. The earliest warriors of the Erdtree, now branded as aberrations, still believed that the divine was not order, but unity, that all things, even decay and mutation, were part of the whole. They gathered in secret, guarding relics of the old faith. It is whispered that they still prayed not to the radiant tree above, but to the roots below. And deep within those roots, the Erdtree listened. The rise of the Golden Order fundamentalists would seal the city's transformation. These scholars and clerics sought to codify faith itself, to make divinity measurable. Their laws decreed that every soul, every being, must conform to the logic of grace. Anything that did not, the omen, the crucible-born, the accursed, was to be purged or purified. This doctrine shaped every law of the capital. The omen children born beneath Leyndell's spires were cast into the catacombs, their existence stricken from record. The Crucible Knights, once revered, were forbidden to show their mutations, and those who dared speak of the Erdtree's primordial past were branded as blasphemers. Still, Marika's silence was deafening. Some said she had grown distant from her people, spending years secluded in divine meditation. Others whispered that she questioned the very will she once embodied. Radagon, meanwhile, became the city's living face, the red-haired half of godhood, visible and stern. He presided over the Colosseum of the Golden Lineage, where champions tested their might in ritual combat. To the people, he was both a philosopher and a warrior, the embodiment of discipline. To the clergy, he was proof that even the gods must labor to uphold perfection. And yet, even he could sense the unease in the air. The Golden Order had become too rigid, too absolute. It sought to define even the mysteries it could not understand. But mysteries do not die. They wait. While the priests refined law, others sought power. Among the capital's defenders arose a sect devoted to the ancient dragons, not in defiance of the Erdtree, but in reverence of what they represented. These were the Dragon Cult Knights, disciples of Godwyn's ancient bond with Fortisax. They believed that lightning was the purest expression of the Erdtree's wrath, a remnant of the old war sanctified by the new faith. Their temples stood along the outer walls, decorated with runes of thunder and wings of gold. Within, they performed rituals that channeled dragonfire into holy lightning, calling upon the spirits of slain dragons to grant them might. In time, their faith became an accepted, if dangerous, branch of the Golden Order. But as decades passed, their lightning darkened, no longer gold, but red, a corruption of the divine flame. Whispers spread that they sought communion not with the Erdtree's grace, but with the memory of the dragons themselves, and among the nobility, suspicion grew. The dragon cult's decline mirrored the fading vigor of the city. What had once been radiant certainty was now gilded exhaustion. The people still prayed, but the prayers were rote. The priests still chanted, but their hymns were hollow. Leyndell still shone, but its light no longer reached the heart. It was during this golden stillness that the night of the Black Knives was first whispered, a rumor carried on winds that smelled faintly of ash. Few could imagine that such an age could end. The Erdtree still glowed, the capital still thrived, but beneath the gold, something was stirring, in the roots, in the souls of gods and men alike. For Marika had begun to change. Her divine stillness turned to contemplation, and contemplation to doubt. The laws she had written, the perfection she had built, all of it felt brittle. And in the silence of her throne, she began to hear a new sound, the pulse of the world beneath, the heartbeat of the crucible she had tried to erase. It is said that during this age, she descended into the depths beneath the Erdtree and looked upon the roots herself. There, she beheld what the priests had denied, that the Erdtree was not eternal, but growing, and all things that grow one day must die. The golden light of the capital was not eternal. It was the slow burning flame of a divine star, beautiful, unyielding, and doomed to fade. The Age of Radiance would be remembered as the height of the Golden Order's glory, but from its heart of light, shadow began to bloom, and the first cracks of eternity spread silently beneath the golden streets. Chapter 4: The War Against the Dragons. Before the Erdtree's light conquered the heavens, the skies themselves belonged to another age, a time when the clouds glowed crimson with storms, and lightning did not fall from above, it rose from the wings of dragons. They were the first sovereigns of the lands between, timeless beings born from the crucible's chaos, their scales forged by the primal forces of creation. Before there was grace, there was storm. Before there was order, there was thunder. And when the Golden Order rose, it found in the dragons both its greatest rival and its reflection. Long before Leyndell's walls gleamed, when the Erdtree was still a sapling of divine fire, dragons ruled the skies above its roots. They were not beasts, nor gods, but something between, vast, eternal, terrible. They did not build cities, they were cities, their wings spanning mountain ranges, their voices shaking the air like music made of thunder. To the early peoples of the lands between, dragons were both destroyers and protectors, embodiments of a wild and unshaped divinity that preceded law. The ancient dragons, led by their lord, Plasudisax, were the true inheritors of the primal world. He was the Elden Lord of an age before the Erdtree, when the greater will of the cosmos had not yet turned its gaze upon this land. Plasudisax's throne lay in the storm-shrouded craters of Farum Azula, a city built of impossible stone that drifted in the skies like a broken memory. There, he communed with two unknown gods, twin divinities who would one day abandon him, leaving the Dragon Empire fractured, its lords scattered like embers on the wind. It was in this twilight of the dragon's reign that Marika's age began. When the greater will descended, it was not with peace, but with replacement. The Erdtree's light sought to overwrite the old order, and dragons, as remnants of the Crucible's chaos, stood in defiance. Thus began the first and longest of all divine wars, the War of the Ancient Dragons. Under Marika's banner, Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, led the armies of men and gods alike against the skies. His golden host carried banners embroidered with the Erdtree's rune, while the dragons brought storms that turned the air to fire. Their lightning was not like the gold of the Erdtree. It was red, wild, filled with the rage of the world's first life. The war raged for decades, its battles stretching across mountaintops, plains, and the edges of the capital itself. The skies above Leyndell were darkened by storms so vast they blotted out the Erdtree's glow. Entire armies were incinerated in a single breath. And for the first time, Marika's perfect vision of order trembled before the storm. The capital's founding knights became legends during this war, men and women whose loyalty to Marika never faltered, even as their comrades burned to ash. Among them were those who bore dragon wounds, burns seared so deeply that the skin beneath shimmered like scales. They became the first initiates of what would later evolve into the dragon cult. Though the Order saw the dragons as enemies, these knights could not deny the awe they felt, the sense that in slaying the dragons, they were killing something sacred. The war reached its turning point when Godfrey himself faced one of the greatest of the Dragon Lords, the crimson-scaled Grandsax. It is said that the beast descended upon Leyndell itself, its body coiling around the walls like a living storm. The air screamed as its lightning tore the spires asunder, and for a moment, it seemed the city would fall. But Godfrey, wielding the Erdtree's blessing, struck the dragon down with divine fury. The blow was said to be so powerful that it split the sky, leaving a scar that even now can be seen in the horizon beyond the capital's ruins. Grandsax fell, his body turning to stone as the Erdtree's grace extinguished his flame. His colossal corpse became part of the capital itself, a monument to the victory of order over storm. Even in death, his form rests upon the city's walls, a silent witness to the Golden Order's triumph and its sins. With Grandsax's fall, the dragon host scattered. Plasudasax retreated into Faro Missoula, wounded and abandoned by his gods. The remaining dragons fled to the peaks of the world, where even the Erdtree's light could not reach. The war was won, but the victory came at a cost, one the Order would not yet understand. For in defeating the dragons, Marika had not destroyed chaos. She had merely buried it beneath the roots of her new world. When peace finally returned to the skies, the war's scars remained. The land was blackened, The air still tasted of ozone and blood. The survivors among the knights and priests prayed to the Erdtree for forgiveness, yet many found themselves haunted by what they had seen, by the majesty of the creatures they had slain. Among them was Godwyn the Golden, son of Marika and Godfrey, and the soul of the golden lineage. In the years after the war, he journeyed beyond the capital, seeking to understand the dragon's nature. And it was there, in the ash-choked fields where the last dragon lords lay dying, that he found Fortisax. The ancient dragon had been struck down, but not slain. Its wings were torn, its lightning dimmed, yet its eyes still burned with a strange, mournful light. Where others would have raised their blades, Godwyn knelt. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as kin, acknowledging the dragon's honor, its defiance, its will to live. And in that moment, a bond was forged that would outlast the ages. Fortisax swore fealty not to the Golden Order, but to Godwyn himself. Their friendship became the foundation of a new faith within Leyndell, the ancient dragon cult. Its followers sought to reconcile the old storm with the new light, believing that the Erdtree's grace was not meant to erase chaos, but to refine it. They learned to channel lightning through faith, wielding red bolts that burned with divine sanction. It was said that when the cult's knights fought, thunder itself bowed before them. The dragon cult grew quickly within the capital, attracting knights, priests, and scholars who longed for a faith of power rather than peace. Its temples, adorned with serpentine motifs and gilded dragon wings, stood proudly among the marble structures of Leyndell. Unlike the orthodox priests of the Golden Order, the cult believed that strength was not sin, that the storm was the Erdtree's gift to the world. For a time, the Order tolerated them. Marika herself remained silent, neither condemning nor condoning their practices. Perhaps she saw in them a fragment of truth, or perhaps she simply wished to keep peace within her perfect city. Under the guidance of the ancient dragon knights, the cult's rites became both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Initiates would stand upon the city walls during thunderstorms, holding rods of gold and bronze aloft, praying for the dragon's lightning to strike them. Those who survived were said to have been touched by the storm, their blood forever infused with thunder. These chosen few became Leyndell's elite defenders, protectors of the capital's outer gates. But power breeds envy, and envy invites judgment. The orthodox priests began to fear the cult's influence. They claimed that the lightning of the dragons was not grace, but remnant sin, a taint of the crucible that corrupted the purity of the Erdtree. And in time, their fear became decree. The Council of Fundamentalists outlawed the cult's practices, branding its followers as heretics. Temples were seized, relics destroyed, and the Dragon Knights were forced to swear new oaths, under the watchful eye of the two fingers. The cult's golden lightning was replaced by the purified white of the Order, but their faith did not die. In secret, they continued to worship, hiding their relics beneath the very cathedrals built to suppress them. Among them, one relic was most sacred, a fragment of Fortisax's scale, glowing faintly red. It was said to hold the essence of storm and life intertwined, proof that the chaos and order were never enemies, but reflections of one truth. As years passed, Fortisax himself took refuge beneath the Erdtree, bound not by chains, but by devotion. There, he kept vigil beside his friend, Godwyn the Golden, long after the prince's tragic death. When the Night of the Black Knives claimed Godwyn's soul, it was Fortisax who tried to fight against the spreading rod of death within him. The dragon's lightning, once a force of destruction, became an act of love, desperate attempt to preserve the golden lineage. Thus, the dragons who were once the Erdtree's greatest foes became its secret guardians. Their lightning, their flame, their storm, all turned towards defending the world that had destroyed their kind. Yet the irony of it was cruel, for while Fortisax slept in sorrow and Leyndell's priests prayed above him, the capital itself began to forget. The war faded into legend, and legend into myth. The people no longer remembered that the very foundations of their city were built atop a dragon's corpse. They no longer saw the storm and the light. They saw only gold, and gold, left to shine too long, begins to tarnish. Chapter 5: The Seeds of Decay. At the height of Leyndell's glory, the world stood still. The Erdtree glowed in eternal day, its golden light as soft as honey and unchanging as law. Every voice within the capital spoke of the same truth, the same perfection, that the Golden Order was absolute, and that the will of the Erdtree was the will of all creation. But beneath that serene stillness, something imperceptible began to move. Not a tremor of stone or thunder, but a shift of spirit, quiet, inexorable, and alive. The first stirring of doubt within the divine. It began, as most endings do, not with rebellion, but with reflection. Queen Marika the Eternal had built a paradise, a world where death was contained, where chaos was subdued. And yet, for all its perfection, her creation had become motionless. Every prayer was answered before it was uttered, every life predetermined by grace. It was a world without suffering, but also without growth. And in the stillness, Marika began to hear the echo of her own creation, hollow, flawless, and endlessly repeating. It was in this silence that the goddess began to turn inward. The very perfection she had built now bound her, for she herself was subject to the greater will, the cosmic authority that had granted her power through the Elden Ring. She was the vessel, not the master. And as she gazed upon the unchanging light of the Erdtree, she wondered, if the order of the world admits no flaw, how then can it be made new? To her priests and subjects, nothing seemed amiss. Marika's statues still gleamed, her name still resounded through the hymns of worship. But those who had eyes to see, the scholars of the order, the old crucible knights, and even some among her kin, began to sense a difference. Where once she had spoken with fervor, she now spoke with distance. Where once her grace flowed easily, it began to falter, dimming like the last light of evening. It was in this twilight of faith that Radagon emerged, a figure both savior and mystery. He had first appeared in the north among the scholars of the Academy of Rea Lucaria, where his wisdom and valor made him a hero. He was red-haired, fair, and radiant, a mirror to Marika's golden calm. When he came to Leyndell, the people called him the Second Light, believing him a chosen vessel sent to renew the Erdtree's brilliance. But those closest to Marika understood something deeper, that Radagon was not merely her consort, he was her other half. How one being could exist as two was beyond mortal understanding. The priests declared it divine mystery. The philosophers debated whether Radagon and Marika were one soul in two forms, or two wills inhabiting one godly frame. But to Marika, it was not philosophy, it was torment. Radagon represented all that she was not, rigid where she was yielding, ascetic where she was compassionate. He was law embodied, purity without question, the living manifestation of order that she herself had begun to doubt. And thus began a strange internal conflict, a god divided against itself, each half seeking to reconcile or overcome the other. Leyndell, in its blind devotion, saw only holiness. But what truly stirred behind its marble facades was schism. As the divine couple's mystery deepened, the city itself began to change. The temples of the old faiths, the dragon cult, the remnants of the crucible worshippers, grew quieter with each passing year. The priests of the fundamentalists outlawed more and more of their sacred practices, erasing history in the name of purity. The crucible knights, whose twisted forms once guarded the Erdtree's gates, were now deemed impure, echoes of a forgotten era. Many were hunted, their relics confiscated, their names struck from record. Yet the deeper the order tried to cleanse itself, the more its corruption grew. For perfection, enforced by decree, can only breed decay in silence. Beneath the golden streets, the catacombs of Leyndell began to overflow. The Omen children, horned and marked by the crucible's touch, were cast into those depths by the thousands. Their cries echoed beneath the marble pavements of the holy city. The priests called it mercy, that the unclean should live beneath the light rather than perish in darkness. But those who had heard the muffled wailing in the night could not help but wonder whose mercy it truly was. And still, the Erdtree glowed above, unbothered. Its light did not falter, for light does not see the shadow it casts. Amid this quiet suffocation, the scholars of the Golden Order pursued what they believed would perfect their doctrine: the study of regression and causality, twin principles that governed all existence. Regression was the law of return, that all things, if observed deeply enough, would revert to their true form. Causality was the law of connection, that every act, every moment, was bound to every other by divine design. In their laboratories and sanctums, these fundamentalists sought to prove that even the mysteries of godhood could be reduced to formula, that they created symbols, circles, and equations meant to explain the Elden Ring's will, believing that knowledge itself was the truest form of worship. They claimed that through understanding regression, one could trace all creation back to its source, perhaps even to the greater will itself. But in their zeal, they forgot humility. For every law they uncovered, another law eluded them, and each revelation brought them closer not to faith, but to madness. It was said that one among them, a scholar named Goldmask, came closest to the truth. He walked the streets of Leyndell in silence, never speaking a word, his gaze fixed always upon the Erdtree. Those who saw him swore he could perceive the lines of grace as one might see sunlight through leaves, the flow of causality itself. He spoke not, because words were insufficient to express what he saw. And those who tried to follow his example either transcended understanding or lost themselves entirely. Even Marika took note of his devotion, for in Goldmask's stillness, she saw something she had long forgotten: the reverence of wonder, untainted by ambition. But even that, she feared, would not last. The deeper Marika's doubt grew, the more she withdrew from her people. She no longer held court. The two fingers, emissaries of the greater will, began to speak on her behalf. The priests told the people that their goddess had transcended mortal concerns, that she now communed directly with the divine. But the truth was quieter and far more human. Marika no longer trusted the will that spoke through them, for she had begun to see the cost of obedience. Her husband, or her other self, Radagon, preached unity and sacrifice. Her children were divided between cursed and sanctified, their fates written by laws she no longer believed just. Her subjects worshipped her not as a guide, but as an idea, immutable, perfect, untouchable. And what is divinity, she wondered, when it can no longer change? It was during this long silence that she first acted against the greater will. No one knows the exact moment of rebellion, only that something within the Erdtree's core began to stir. Perhaps she altered a rune. Perhaps she merely wished to see if she could. But what is known as this, the Elden Ring, shattered. The reason the scholars would debate for ages. Some claimed it was a test, that the greater will itself demanded the shattering to renew the world. Others whispered that Marika struck the ring in defiance, breaking the chains that bound her to divine servitude. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The Golden Order, which had once encompassed all of creation, was undone in a single, impossible instant. The shattering of the Elden Ring was not like an explosion. It was not fire or thunder or destruction. It was a sound, soft like glass under strain, spreading across the roots of the world. The Erdtree's light flickered just once and then steadied again. But something fundamental had changed. The invisible threads of law that bound all things began to fray. Death, once confined, stirred in its prison. Time, once perfect, began to ripple. In the streets of Leyndell, no one noticed at first. The bells still rang, the priests still sang. But in the catacombs, corpses began to whisper. In the tombs, golden statues wept sap like blood. And far below, the Omen children stirred from restless dreams. The Seeds of Decay had taken root. The city's beauty began to change in ways too subtle for most to see. The marble lost its luster. The gardens, once ever blooming, began to sprout pale, lifeless flowers that grew without scent. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken tension. And though the Erdtree still bathed the world in light, that light felt colder, a glow not of grace, but of memory. Marika vanished from public view. Radagon, her counterpart, assumed command of the Order. He preached repentance, law, and restoration, yet every word was shadowed by desperation. He called for unity, but the people heard only fear, for in their hearts they knew the Golden Order had been broken, and no god could mend it. And then came the night of the Black Knives, when the unthinkable occurred. Death, long denied by the Erdtree, was stolen from its prison and used as a weapon. Assassins, cloaked in darkness, struck down Godwyn the Golden, Marika's beloved son, the first demigod to die. But it was no ordinary death. His body lived, yet his soul perished. He became something neither living nor dead, a blasphemy against both life and the Erdtree's law. The news spread through Leyndell like fire through dry grass. The people wept in the streets. Priests fell silent. Even the Erdtree's light dimmed for a moment, as if mourning. And in that silence, something inside Marika broke beyond repair. She had built her world upon the promise that death could be contained, but now death had escaped. Her son, her golden heir, was lost, his body entombed beneath the capital, his soul wandering in a half-existence that defied even the gods. And so, In grief and fury, Marika took the hammer once more and struck the Elden Ring, this time not as rebellion, but as lamentation. The shattering was complete. The gods fell silent. The greater will withdrew its gaze, and the paradise that had once gleamed like eternity began to crumble from within. When dawn broke over the capital, the Erdtree still stood, unchanged in shape, but hollow in spirit. Its leaves no longer shimmered with warmth, only brilliance, cold, distant, eternal. The priests proclaimed that the goddess had gone into divine mourning, but the faithful could feel the truth in their bones. The Age of Radiance had ended. In the years that followed, decay would spread like ivy through marble. The gardens turned to dust. The fountains ran dry. Statues cracked, their golden faces flaking away to reveal stone beneath. And those who still prayed found their faith met with silence. Leyndell had not yet fallen, but it was dying, not in battle, but in meaning. And deep beneath the city, where the roots of the Erdtree intertwined with the tomb of Godwyn, something else began to stir. Something that smelled of rot and memory and sorrow. The Golden Order had been perfect, but perfection, untouched, cannot live. And from the perfection of gold was born the first taste of death. Chapter 6: The Shattering of the Elden Ring. When gods break their own laws, the world forgets how to breathe. And so it was on that night, when the hammer struck and the Elden Ring was undone. The light of the Erdtree, once the measure of all order, flickered like a dying sun. For a single heartbeat, every being in the lands between, mortal, beast, and demigod alike, felt the tremor of unmaking. The world did not end that night. It simply lost its center. It began as a sound, a ringing, distant but infinite, like the echo of glass shattering across eternity. The Erdtree shuddered. The ground split in seams that glowed with golden light. And from within the divine geometry of the Elden Ring, the perfect circle became chaos, fragments spinning through the soul of creation, each carrying a portion of law, now divorced from the whole. The priests of the Golden Order fell to their knees, clawing at their temples, for they could no longer hear the rhythm of grace. The two fingers, messengers of the greater will, convulsed in their sanctum, their gestures twisting into new, incomprehensible forms. Even the fundamentalists, who had once thought to explain the Erdtree through reason, were struck blind by the sight, for the pattern of the world had become unknowable. In Leyndell streets, the people looked up at the tree and wept. Its light still shone, but now it burned without warmth, a hollow radiance, like a lantern whose flame has been replaced by memory. They did not yet understand that their goddess had broken the very fabric of divinity. Above them, in the sanctified throne, Queen Marika the Eternal stood among the fragments of what had been the Elden Ring. Her body trembled with exhaustion. In her hands, the hammer, the same tool that had once forged divine order, was slick with her own blood. Around her, the runes of the ring floated, each representing a fundamental truth of the cosmos. Death, life, time, order, chaos, and all the rest. But where once they had formed a perfect whole, now they revolved endlessly, unanchored, a divine constellation torn from unity. It was then that Radagon, her other half, appeared, not as husband, not as separate being, but as mirror. He reached for the pieces, weeping without tears. Let it be whole again, he prayed, his voice trembling like thunder beneath the earth. But Marika turned her eyes upon him, eyes that had seen eternity and found it wanting, and she whispered, "No." They say he tried to mend what she had broken. They say he bound himself to the ring's remnants, his will entwining with the very laws of the world, and in doing so, he became its prisoner, a god chained to the fragments of his own faith. Marika vanished, her fate uncertain. Some claim she was sealed within the Erdtree itself. Others that she dissolved into the same divine essence she once commanded. But from that moment, there was no longer one god in Leyndell, nor even two. Only echoes, struggling to hold together a world that had already begun to fall apart. The shattering of the Elden Ring scattered its power across the lands between. Each fragment became a great rune, a crystallized law embodying one facet of divine authority. Those who possessed them could command godlike might, but none could restore the whole. And so, in the vacuum of order, ambition awoke. The demigods, Marika's own children and kin, rose from grief into hunger. They each claimed a great rune, believing themselves the rightful heir to the Elden Throne. Where once they had shared divine blood, now they shared only enmity. And from that enmity was born the age's defining conflict, the Shattering War. Leyndell, once the heart of harmony, became its battlefield. In the days following the ring's destruction, Leyndell fell into chaos. Without the unifying grace of the Erdtree, the city's hierarchy unraveled. The noble houses turned upon one another, each aligning themselves with different demigods: Morgott, Mohg, Godric, Rykard, Malenia, Mikella, Radon, and Ranni. Names that would one day become legend and curse alike. The high priests of the Golden Order, desperate to maintain control, proclaimed that Marika's will still guided the world. But their words rang hollow. Without divine communion, their miracles faltered. Their prayers returned only silence, and in that silence, the people began to despair. Panic swept the streets. Fires burned in the noble districts as rival factions clashed for control of the sanctuaries. Temples that had once been devoted to grace now echoed with screams on steel. The faithful tore down icons of the goddess, fearing her wrath. Others built altars in her defense, begging her to return. The very walls of the capital, once radiant, became soaked in blood. It was then that Morgott, the omen son of Marika and Godfrey, emerged from the depths. For centuries, Morgott had been confined beneath the city, one of the cursed twin brothers, born marked with the Crucible's impurity. But when the Shattering came, the chains of the old order broke. He rose from the catacombs, his horns gleaming faintly in the dying light of grace. The people recoiled, for they saw in him the face of the impure. Yet when he spoke, his words carried both sorrow and conviction. "The Erdtree is my mother's soul," he said, "and I will defend it, even if it rejects me." While other demigods waged war for power, Morgott chose duty. He rallied what remained of the Golden Knights, and the last of the Crucible faithful, and the few priests whose faith had not yet turned to dust. Together, they fortified the capital, sealing its gates against both invaders and heretics. For though the Erdtree's light had dimmed, Morgott refused to let it die. Under his command, Leyndell endured the first onslaughts of the Shattering War. Godric of the Golden Lineage, descendant of Godfrey and the self-proclaimed heir, led an army to claim the throne. He was repelled, his pride broken, forced to flee back to Stormvale. Rykard, consumed by heresy and ambition, turned his attention elsewhere, delving into the fires of Mount Gelmir. Radahn, the mightiest general of them all, held the eastern marches, staring into the stars as if waiting for fate itself to move. And in the north, Rani the Witch vanished from the world entirely, leaving only whispers of the moon behind her. But for all Morgott's victories, he was unloved. The people called him the Fell Omen, a monster wearing the crown of the pure. Even as he defended them, they feared his blood, and yet he never turned away. His faith was unshakable, not in himself, not in his siblings, but in the Erdtree that had spurned him. He ruled Leyndell in secret, masking his name with another, Morgott the Fell, the Dread Warden who guarded the gates against all who sought the throne. To the Tarnished who would come later, he would be known as Terror. But to the city he kept from ruin, he was salvation unrecognized. Beyond the walls of Leyndell, the world burned, each demigod, bearing their great rune, carved their own dominion from the wreckage of the Golden Order. Godric fortified the western cliffs, grafting the limbs of his fallen foes to his own body to simulate strength he did not possess. Rykard, in the volcanic heart of Gelmir, fed himself to the great serpent to gain blasphemous immortality. Radahn, ever the general, stood as an immovable bulwark against all, his mind slowly eroding under the rot of war. Melania, afflicted with scarlet rot, marched south in her radiant armor to conquer Caelid, a war that would leave both warriors and the land itself in ruin. And Ronnie, far to the north, worked in shadow, weaving a new fate for the stars. The Erdtree's grace no longer flowed freely. Where it once connected all life, now it was scattered, faint embers clinging to those it still deemed worthy. The Tarnished, once exiled by Marika in ages past, began to stir beyond the fog. The faint whisper of grace called them home, as if the world itself sought repair through the hands of the forgotten. But in Leyndell, the call went unheard. The city's people, hemmed in by fear and faith, clung to the Erdtree's light, even as it burned them. Deep beneath the capital, beneath the crypt where Godwyn the Golden lay entombed, rot began to bloom. The assassination of Godwyn had left him half dead, his body preserved by grace, his soul devoured by death itself. From his corrupted flesh, a new phenomenon emerged, the death root, a black network of veins spreading through the Erdtree's roots, feeding on its vitality. It crept upwards slowly, silently, through the soil and the catacombs, until it reached the foundations of the capital itself. Those attuned to grace could feel it, the faint pulse of something beneath, growing stronger with each year. Priests reported dreams of a shadowed Erdtree, its leaves black and dripping with blood. Some awoke with golden tears hardened into amber stones. Deathblight crystals they were called, relics of blasphemy. Morgott forbade their collection, but the faithful traded them in secret, believing they held fragments of Godwyn's sorrow. The city above still glittered in sunlight, but its roots were already dying. As war consumed the land, Leyndell became a fortress, a sanctuary, and a tomb. Its walls repelled all invaders, yet its soul withered. The royal palace, once filled with song and sermon, now echoed only with the whispers of the two fingers. Their words, twisted, uncertain, no longer the voice of grace, but of confusion. Marika was gone, Radagon silent, the Erdtree unresponsive. And in the void of divinity, the people began to worship not gods, but memory. Statues of Godwyn were erected in every district, depicting him as both martyr and saint. His face, serene even in death, became the new symbol of devotion. The irony was cruel. The city built upon faith and life now prayed to the image of the dead. Morgott kept his vigil upon the throne, watching as the streets below grew emptier with each passing season. The nobles fled, the knights dwindled, the priests vanished into their cathedrals. The golden banners still hung, but they fluttered over silence. The shattering war raged on outside the walls, but within them, Leyndell had already fallen into a different kind of ruin. Not the ruin of conquest, but of stillness. For what can a city of gods become when its gods are gone? Chapter 7. Morgott, King of the Capital. When the world forgets its gods, Sometimes the outcast remembers for all of them. That is who Morgott, the last true king of the capital, became. A monarch without coronation, a guardian no one asked for, a son who loved the tree that never once looked back. He was born beneath the Erdtree's brightest hour, yet greeted only by shadows. A twin of blood and curse, Morgott came into the world with horns upon his brow, sign of the omen, the ancient taint of the crucible that the Golden Order had sworn to erase. His brother, Mohg, bore the same mark. In the holy city that claimed purity as its law, their birth was considered sin incarnate. The midwives veiled their eyes. The priests whispered prayers of apology to the Erdtree. By decree of the court, the infants were taken below, to the endless catacombs carved beneath Leyndell's marble streets. There, amid damp stone and the scent of incense and rot, they were chained with the rest of the condemned. No sunlight, no grace, no mother's voice ever reached them. Their lullabies were the echoes of the city above. Mohg raged against his prison and dreamed of crimson kingdoms. Morgott prayed. He prayed to the light that he had never seen. He whispered the name Marika until it became both curse and comfort. Even when he learned what his mother had decreed, he did not turn from her, for faith was all he had. Years became decades. The priests forgot the omen existed. The nobles sealed the catacombs. But when the Shattering came and the world convulsed, the gates below cracked open. Morgott climbed from darkness into the ruins of the Golden City. He saw the Erdtree for the first time, its trunk vast, its light pale, its silence complete. And in that moment, he decided that if no one else would protect it, he would. The capital was chaos when he emerged. Nobles fought over empty titles, priests over hollow scripture. The Erdtree's grace no longer guided miracles. The sky itself seemed weary. Yet when Morgott strode through the streets, his horns glinting in the ashen dawn, his cloak stitched from the banners of fallen knights, the people fell silent. They did not cheer. They stared. For the first time, the impurity they had buried looked back at them and carried a sword in defense of their god. Morgott's rule began without ceremony. He claimed no crown, gave no proclamations. He simply stood before the Erdtree's doors and swore an oath that even the gods had forgotten to keep. So long as I draw breath, none shall profane the tree. From that day, the surviving Golden Knights, the remnants of the Crucible faith, and the few priests whose devotion outlasted despair gathered around him. They called him Your Grace in secret, though he forbade it. To the city at large, he remained a phantom ruler, the veiled king, the fell omen, the warden of a throne no one else desired. For years uncounted, Morgott held the capital against every claimant to the Elden Throne. From the west came Godric the Grafted, dragging behind him an army stitched from corpses. Morgott met him at the gate front and broke him in a single night. The people said that the sky wept blood, and the Erdtree itself trembled at the sound of their clash. Godric fled to Stormvale, nursing his humiliation. From the north rode champions in the name of Rykard and Radon. Both tested the capital's walls and found them impenetrable. When General Radon, the Red Lion, challenged Morgott to single combat beyond the walls, legend says the two fought beneath a silent Erdtree. Neither could best the other, but when dawn came, Radon knelt in exhaustion while Morgott still stood. Out of respect, the general withdrew. The bards never sang of that battle, for no victor emerged, only two warriors bound by duty to different gods. Inside the city, Morgott rebuilt what little he could. He reopened the granaries, restored the aqueducts, and lit the lanterns along the royal road so that pilgrims of the fading faith might still find their way. He outlawed executions of the Omen, declaring that all life beneath the Erdtree was sacred, a decree the priests obeyed in silence, but never accepted. He never demanded worship, only service. And still, the people called him Monster. At night, Morgott walked alone through the empty halls of the sanctified throne. The great seat of Marika was vacant, its runes dull. He would kneel there and pray as he had done in the dark of his childhood, that the Erdtree might speak, that his mother might forgive him, that grace might return. But the only answer was the whisper of ash against marble. He began to speak to the Erdtree aloud, as if to a parent gone deaf. You shunned me, yet I guard you. You scorned me, yet I love you still. In time, his prayers became confessions, and his confessions became sermons to no congregation. Scholars of later ages would find fragments of his writings, lines etched on broken stone and rusted blades. The greater will sees not its shadow. I am that shadow, yet still I serve. Though unloved, he never faltered. The Erdtree avatars that patrolled the outer districts recognized him, and the grace within their hollow hearts did not strike him down. Even the spirits of long-dead knights seemed to bow as he passed. It was as if the Erdtree itself, though silent, acknowledged the devotion of its forsaken son. Below the city, his brother Mohg brooded, while Morgott swore loyalty to the Erdtree. Mohg had turned to another power, the Formless Mother, the god of blood. He sought to build a dynasty of his own, one soaked in crimson sacrament and despair. He sent whispers through the sewers, promising liberation to the Omen and vengeance upon the Golden Order. Morgott heard every rumor and silenced each uprising himself. When the brothers finally met, it was deep beneath the subterranean shunning grounds, amid roots blackened by deathroot. Mohg called to him, "Brother, come, abandon this rotten tree and share my throne of blood." Morgott looked upon him with pity, not hatred. "I will not forsake her," he said simply, "even if she has long forsaken me." They fought, though neither son sought the other's death. In the end, Mohg retreated into the depths, and Morgott returned above, bleeding but unbroken. From that day, he sealed the tunnels beneath the city, ensuring that the dynasty of blood would never touch the roots of the Erdtree. It was an act of protection and penance. As centuries bled into one another and the wars beyond the capital consumed themselves, Morgott remained. The Tarnished began to return. Warriors, guided by faint grace to test their worth against the remnants of godhood. Each arrived at Leyndell, believing themselves destined to become Elden Lord. Each found Morgott waiting. He greeted them, not with cruelty, but with weary courtesy. "Whence cometh this hunger for the throne?" he would ask. "Hast thou known naught but suffering, and yet seekest more?" Then he would raise his great blade, the cursed sword of Morgott, its edge wrapped in thorns that bled golden fire, and the duel would begin. To those who survived long enough to hear his final words, he would say, "I am Morgott, last of all kings. None shall claim the throne while I draw breath." No champion ever passed him in his lifetime. The Erdtree's doors remained sealed, and the capital stood, a corpse city preserved by a single stubborn heart. Morgott's love for the Erdtree was not born of joy, but of devotion beyond reason. He saw its flaws, its cruelty, its silence, and loved it still. He believed that if he could prove his loyalty, perhaps the tree would one day remember him. But when the tarnished champion, bearer of new grace, came at last and struck him down, the truth was laid bare. As he lay dying upon the steps of the throne, he looked once more toward the Erdtree's trunk. Its golden light shimmered, cold and impenetrable. And in that final moment, he laughed softly, a laugh not of mockery, but of release. "Oh, I knew thou wouldst not let me in, yet still I loved thee, my dear Erdtree." With those words, the last king of the capital fell. The Erdtree did not answer. It did not mourn, but the wind that passed through its branches carried a single golden leaf down into the empty city, and it settled upon Morgott's still hand. In the days that followed, no new monarch rose. The throne stood vacant, the streets deserted, save for the ghosts of knights who refused to die. The Erdtree's roots thickened, sealing the inner sanctum. The people who remained fled or turned to dust. Thus ended the reign of the only king who had ever truly loved the city. He left behind no dynasty, no scripture, no monument, only silence, and a memory that the Golden Order, for all its grandeur, had once been kept alive by an outcast's faith. To later generations, Morgott became a legend, spoken in hushed tones. Some called him saint, others monster. But those who looked upon the ashen gates of the ruined capital would sometimes feel, for just a moment, a warmth like fading sunlight on their faces. And they would know that somewhere, in the heart of the Erdtree's vast shadow, loyalty had not been entirely forgotten. Chapter 8: The Age of Tarnish. The bells of Leyndell have been silent for so long that even their echo has turned to dust. What remains of the Golden Order sleeps beneath layers of ash and memory, watched only by the unmoving tree that birthed it. Once, every stone of this city hummed with grace. Now, even the wind seems afraid to speak its name. Far beyond the fog, the Tarnished stirred. They were the children of Godfrey's long exile, warriors stripped of grace, yet never of hunger. When the Elden Ring shattered, a faint light awakened in their eyes, a whisper from the Erdtree that none within the lands between could hear. It was not mercy that called them, it was need. The world had fallen still, and the greater will sought motion once more. They came by sea, by storm, by dream. Each bore a story written in scars. Knights who had forgotten their banners, mages whose stars had gone dark, nameless wanderers clutching fragments of faith. They walked the long roads towards the Golden City, guided by threads of grace like the veins of a dying star. In every age before, Leyndell had shone to the world. Now, the Tarnished came to find only its reflection, a city half buried in its own light. After Morgott's fall, the Erdtree had grown strange. Its leaves no longer drifted down in blessing. They hung motionless, as if carved from glass. When the Tarnished reached its roots, they found the great doors fused shut by living bark, gold hard as stone. No prayer, no flame, no rune could open them. The priests who survived called it the miracle of denial, the Erdtree refusing death itself, locking heaven away from the unworthy. But to those who still sought to serve it, the act felt like betrayal. Thousands gathered outside the sealed trunk, pilgrims and knights alike, waiting for the grace to speak again. They built shrines from broken marble and burned offerings until the air tasted of char. Some starved there, kneeling, believing that patience was holiness. Others broke and turned to new gods, whispering to spirits of rot, flame, or night. Within the city, the Golden Order splintered further. Every sect proclaimed itself the true heir to Marika's will. The fundamentalists preached regression, that the ring must be restored to its first perfect form. The frenzied flames apostles shouted for unmaking, for freedom through madness. And in secret, the followers of Deathroot prayed to the corpse of Godwin, whose black veins now pulsed beneath the capital like roots of an inverted tree. Years became centuries, and the air itself thickened with dust. The Erdtree's golden bark shed in flakes that drifted downward, blanketing rooftops and streets until the city gleamed pale as bone. At first, the people called it blessing. Then they realized it was ash, the slow decay of divinity itself. Fires could no longer stay lit in Leyndell. The ash choked every flame, save for the faint phosphor that glowed within the sap veins of the roots. The once great river dried into a bed of golden silt. Statues leaned, toppled, and were left where they fell, the faces half buried, weeping black sap instead of tears. Out of that ruin rose new faiths born of desperation. Hermits gathered around the fallen statues and claimed to hear them breathe. They called the city the Sanctum of Silence, believing that the gods had not died, but chosen sleep. Each night they sang hymns made of whispers, the only sound that still dared to echo beneath the tree. Among the tarnished, tales spread of the path to the capital. They said it was a test, that grace curved towards Leyndell as water toward the sea. Many followed, fewer arrived. The gates that Morgott once sealed now stood half open, their hinges fused by time. Behind them waited streets twisted by root and ruin. Those who entered spoke of phantoms, golden silhouettes reliving the city's final hours, priests still walking to prayer, knights still saluting an empty throne. When the tarnished reached the Grand Avenue, they found the dragon Grandsax still coiled across the wall, petrified yet somehow alive, lightning whispering in its hollow bones. Beyond lay the throne room, preserved in perfect stillness, Morgott's dried blood black upon the marble. To stand there was to feel the weight of centuries pressing down, every triumph, every betrayal, condensed into silence so deep it hurt to breathe. The greater will had turned away, but another power watched, far beneath the capital, where the death root tangled with molten stone. A whisper of fire awoke. It spoke of freedom through flame, of an ending that would cleanse all things. And from the distant lands came those who carried that fire, the tarnished lords of flame, bearers of the frenzied spark and the destined conflagration. When one such lord reached the foot of the Erdtree and saw its doors sealed, he did what gods would not. He set it alight. The fire climbed the trunk like a scream, devouring gold and memory alike. The sky turned crimson. The ash that fell afterwards was darker, heavier, alive with embers. In that burning, Leyndell changed forever. The Golden City became the Ashen capital. The air shimmered with heat. The cobblestones cracked like scales of charcoal. The Erdtree still stood, but its light was now fire, not grace. Where once perfection had lived, only endurance remained. When the flames died, silence returned, but it was a different silence, not divine, not human. The last citizens wandered through streets knee-deep in cinders, speaking softly so the dust would not choke them. They built small hearths in the ruins and called themselves keepers of the cinders. To them, the Erdtree was no longer a god, but a memory that must be kept warm. They tended its roots as one tends a grave. The tarnished who arrived after the burning found no priests, no laws, only whispers of old battles. Some swore allegiance to no god at all, forging their own runes from fragments of the broken ring. Others sought to revive the Golden Order, clinging to Morgott's forgotten oaths. And a few looked upon the charred trunk and felt something terrible and new, compassion, for the Erdtree, once untouchable, now seemed mortal. At night, the ash stirs. Figures drift through it, not of flesh, but of memory. Morgott upon his throne, still vigilant. Godfrey's lion roaring in mute defiance. Marika and Radagon entwined in golden stillness, the hammer between them. The ghosts reenacted their endless cycle: creation, rebellion, ruin. To watch them is to understand that Leyndell was never truly destroyed. It simply became its own afterlife. In the deepest chambers of the Erdtree, where the flame first bit into root, the Tarnished who end their journey may glimpse them all. There, the shattered fragments of the Elden Ring orbit one another like dying stars, waiting for a new hand to bind them. And from the ashes above, the city listens. The Age of Tarnish is not an age of darkness nor light. It is an age of echoes, of voices repeating the same prayers to different gods, of warriors fighting for meanings long since buried away. Yet through the ruin, something endures. Each time a Tarnish kindles a flame, or kneels before a fragment of gold, Leyndell breathes again for a moment. The wind carries the faintest ring of a distant bell, as if the city itself remembers the sound of its own glory. The Erdtree still stands, its bark blackened, its roots cracked, but deep inside, the trunk glows a thread of light, not gold, not fire, something in between, perhaps grace learning to change, perhaps the last breath of a god learning to die. And in that uncertain glow, the meaning of the Golden Order shifts. No longer perfection imposed from above, but perseverance rising from below. For in the end, it was never the gods who preserved the capital. It was the Tarnished, the flawed, the forgotten, the faithless, who carried its memory forward. When the final pilgrim leaves the city, the ash will settle for good. No songs, no banners, no prayers will remain. Only the outline of a once perfect world burned into stone. And yet, in the stillness, the Erdtree's shadow will stretch across the land like a promise that even ruin has form, even endings have order. For this is the truth of Leyndell, and of all things touched by grace. Gold may fade, faith may fracture, but memory endures. And as long as one wanderer still whispers its name into the ash, the capital will never truly die. Chapter 9. Leyndell in Ruin, the Ashen Capital. When the last flame guttered out, Leyndell stopped making a sound. No birds, no bells, no footsteps, only the soft hiss of ash sliding across stone. The Erdtree stood black against a white sky, its branches like ribs of a burned world. Where once the city had sung hymns of gold, Now every street was an echo chamber for memory. The air itself had changed. Breath tasted of soot and cold sap. Even light seemed tired. Each dawn brought the same gray glow, neither day nor night, the unending twilight of a world that had burned but not died. The Erdtree's roots had cracked open the foundations. They pushed through halls, splitting marble pillars like paper, entwining themselves around statues of Marika and Radagon, until God and root were one indistinguishable shape. In some places, the sap still ran, glowing faintly gold within the charred wood. It dripped into pools that reflected nothing, for the light within them looked inward, not out. Those who dared to wander close heard whispers rising through the roots. Some swore it was the voice of the greater will, calling for repentance. Others said it was the lament of the dead, the countless prayers trapped within the Erdtree's bark, repeating themselves forever. The trunk itself had hardened into black crystal. When struck, it rang like a bell submerged in water, deep, distant, and endless. That tone was the heartbeat of a new age. Everything else had fallen silent to make room for it. The outer districts, once bustling with traders and nobles, had turned into labyrinths of glassy dust. Buildings collapsed inward, their walls preserved only as outlines in cinder. A single step sent ripples through the ash like breath across water. Every motion risked erasing what little shape remained. In the colonnades of the old sanctified throne, black silhouettes were fused to the walls. Men and women, caught in the fire's first breath, their forms burned into permanence. They looked as though they were still kneeling. The fountains of grace had become pillars of salt. The water that once carried light now flowed thick with residue of gold, heavy enough to sink any hand that touched it. The scent was metallic, sweet, wrong, the perfume of divinity rotting. A few still lived among the ruins. They called themselves dust chaplains, heirs to no church, servants to no God. They tended the silent city as one tends a cemetery. Each day they swept the ash from the same doorways, only for it to fall again at night. They spoke little, for sound disturbed the calm they mistook for holiness. Their faith was not in salvation, but in remembrance. They believed that if the shape of the city were maintained, its spirit would never disperse. So they traced the old sigils of grace into the dust, drew halos over doorframes, and whispered names of saints long forgotten. None of them had seen true sunlight. The glow of the Erdtree's remains was enough, the perpetual dawn that promised nothing. Beneath the trunk, through a wound carved by flame, lay the hollow sanctum, where the roots gathered like veins around an empty space. At its center pulsed a single ember, a fragment of the ring, spinning slowly in suspension. Those who approached too near felt their bodies hum with memory, every heartbeat echoing the rhythm of ages past. The ember showed visions to any who looked too long. First came gold, then blood, then ash. It revealed the cycle without comment, without mercy. Many of the dust chaplains perished there, dissolving into gold dust as though accepted back into the pattern they had sought to preserve. No one knew if it was grace or hunger that claimed them. The petrified corpse of Grandsax still coiled across the outer ramparts, larger than the palaces it crushed. Time had stripped even the stone of color. Only faint veins of crimson lightning flickered through its hollow skull. When storms passed over the plains, the lightning struck that skull first, and the entire city glowed red for an instant, the heartbeat of an old war repeating itself. Some of the younger Tarnished believed the dragon still guarded Leyndell, that its spirit refused to abandon the capital it had once tried to destroy. They left offerings of scales and rusted weapons at its feet. When thunder rolled, they claimed it answered. Perhaps it did. After all, even ruin keeps its guardians. Below the ash lay miles of catacombs, older than the Erdtree itself. The fire had burned downward, opening cracks that revealed chambers no one had ever seen, vaults filled with mummified priests, sealed in standing prayer, their skin turned to gold leaf. Between them slithered veins of black root, shot through with faint luminance, the death root still growing from Godwin's corpse far below. Where those roots met the remains of grace, new minerals formed, dark crystals veined with light, pulsing like slow hearts. Scholars who later found them named them echo stones, believing each to be a memory solidified by the meeting of life and death. When ground to powder, they emitted faint music, tones matching the buried bell of the Erdtree's trunk. Thus even the dead continued to sing. In the ruined throne room, Morgott's seat remained untouched. The golden cloth was burned away, leaving only blackened metal fused to the floor. Yet the impression of a figure lingered there, a hollow outline where the fire had not touched, shaped like a man kneeling rather than sitting. Tarnished who reached that chamber reported a strange phenomenon. Their torches dimmed, and for a heartbeat they saw a faint silhouette before the throne, head bowed, sword across his knees. When they blinked, it was gone. Whether ghost or echo, no one knew, but each who saw it felt a surge of quiet resolve, as though the unseen king still watched over the capital. Generations later, when the fires of the outer world cooled, wanderers returned to Leyndell not as conquerors, but as students. They came to learn how perfection dies. Among them were the Order archivists, monks who believed knowledge itself to be the last sacrament of the Golden Order. They mapped every corridor, measured every fracture of the Erdtree's bark, and recorded the slow disintegration of the city with reverence. Their writings, collectively called the Ashen Chronicle, became scripture for a new philosophy, that divinity is not eternity, but process, that even gods must decay to remain true. They claimed the Erdtree had not failed, it had evolved. Its transformation into cinder was simply another phase of grace, teaching the world to endure absence as it once endured law. Few believed them, but their words endured, carved into tablets that glowed faintly when touched by moonlight. In that faint glow, they saw beauty not in permanence, but in ruin, understood. Centuries after the burning, when no one expected life to return, a seed took root in the hollow where Morgott had fallen. No one knew where it came from, perhaps carried by wind, perhaps born of ash itself. It grew into a pale sapling, thin and trembling, its leaves colorless, save for veins that shimmered faintly with both red and gold. The dust chaplains called it the twin leaf, a symbol of balance between grace and flame. It was the first living thing to bloom in the city since the fire. Each year its roots dug deeper into the blackened marble, feeding on cinder and memory, and from its trunk came a soft sound, almost like breathing. Scholars who listened swore it mirrored the rhythm of the Erdtree's buried bell. In time, pilgrims began to arrive again, not to worship the old tree, but to see the new one, small, fragile, alive. They whispered the Erdtree had shed its shell, that life had not endured, but begun anew in humility. The Golden Order, once towering and absolute, had returned in miniature, imperfect, mortal, growing. Thus the city that had been built to defy death became the monument that proved death sacred. Every ruin was a scripture now, every grain of ash a verse. The Erdtree's remains were no longer a god to be obeyed, but a teacher of endings. Where once priests demanded purity, pilgrims now found grace in imperfection. A cracked statue, a broken sword, a seed sprouting through marble. When the wind moved through the empty avenues, it lifted patterns in the dust that resembled wings. The old citizens called it coincidence. The new pilgrims called it miracle. Either way, it was the city breathing. At sunset, when the ashen light turns to silver, the outline of Leyndell glows faintly along its avenues, as though the city itself remembers how to shine. From afar, travelers see a horizon of dim gold rising through the mist and swear the capital still lives. But when they approach, they find only quiet and the low hum of the Erdtree's hollow heart. Perhaps that is enough, for every age needs a witness to the one before, and Leyndell remains, not living, not dead, but watching. The Ashen capital is no longer the seat of gods. It is the mirror, a reminder that all light casts shadow, and all shadow remembers light. Its silence is not despair, but completion. Here ends the journey of the Golden Order, not with triumph or defeat, but with understanding. In the hush of cinder, the wind carries a final truth. Grace was never the gold in the tree, nor the law in the ring. It was the will to keep walking, even after both had burned. Chapter 10: Legacy of the Golden City. Long after the fires cooled, Leyndell remained on every tongue. Travelers spoke its name the way sailors speak of vanished stars. as direction rather than destination. Its ruins became compass points for memory, the place where gods proved mortal and mortals learned to bear divinity. Even those who had never seen the city could draw it from rumor. A forest of pillars, a tree of flame, a throne that waited for no one. To scholars, it was history. To pilgrims, scripture. To poets, a wound that refused to scar. The world itself seemed to orbit its memory, as if gravity still pulled toward the hollow of the Erdtree's trunk. When the Golden Order fell, faith did not end, it multiplied. Each splinter of belief carried a different reflection of Leyndell's light. The fundamentalists kept their studies, reducing grace to theorem and rune. They built tiny gilded towers across the plains, each one a miniature imitation of the capital's spires, hoping that in repetition they might rediscover perfection. They never did. The Dust Chaplain orders, inheritors of the ruined city, practiced silence. They taught that prayer was pride, that to speak to gods was to presume equality. Their monasteries echoed only with the sound of sweeping ash. The dragon cult endured as well, though now its lightning shone white, not red. They claimed the storm had forgiven the flame, that chaos and order were brothers, reconciled in ruin. To them, Leyndell's destruction was not tragedy, but transformation, the proof that even heaven must molt its skin. And in the shadowed north, the followers of Deathroot worshipped the black veins that ran beneath the world. They called Godwyn the Silent King, and believed that the stillness of his corpse was the truest peace. To them, Leyndell's fire had merely finished what the knives began. So many creeds grew from the capital's corpse that faith itself became the city's afterlife. Every shrine, every sermon was another heartbeat of the thing they mourned. Yet despite centuries of reinterpretation, the image of the Golden City never faded. Painters who had never seen it still filled their canvases with impossible radiance. Poets described streets paved in sunlight and towers that sang. Even the humblest hamlet kept a fragment of its architecture, a curved doorway, a column carved with leaves, a single brick of white stone. These were relics not of material, but of an idea, the yearning to touch perfection once more. Children were told stories of Marika the Eternal, who shaped the world with love too heavy to bear. They learned of Godfrey's roar, of Morgott's vigil, of Ranni's rebellion beneath the moon. But always, the tales turned to Leyndell, to the city that held them all like jewels in a broken crown. Some said that the city still dreamed beneath its shell of ash, that the souls of the faithful wandered through phantom streets, awaiting rebirth. And sometimes, on windless nights, travelers camping near its ruins heard faint chimes, as though the bells still remembered the rhythm of worship. A new generation of thinkers rose from the scattered academies. They called themselves renewalists, disciples of both flame and root. They sought not to rebuild the Golden Order, but to understand why it had fallen. Their chronicles described a pattern that stretched across ages: the Crucible, chaos; the Golden Age, order; the Shattering, freedom; the Ashen Age, reflection. They argued that the Erdtree had never failed at all. Each phase was part of its growth, each death a kind of pruning. When they visited the Ashen capital and stood before the small, pale sapling that had sprouted from the blackened trunk, they saw proof of their creed. One scholar wrote, "The Erdtree has shed eternity like a serpent sheds its skin. What remains is mortal, and therefore divine." Among the renewalists, philosophy replaced prayer. They believed remembrance itself was grace, that to remember clearly was holier than to obey blindly. Thus, every archive, every retelling, every whisper of Leyndell kept the divine alive. The tarnished, who had once come seeking power, became the keepers of stories. Those who survived the wars carried fragments of the great runes etched into their flesh or their minds. They wandered the lands, neither rulers nor saints, but storytellers. At campfires, they sang of what they had seen, of Morgott's defiance, of Melania's bloom of rot, of stars returning to motion under Ronnie's moon. Each song was a spark, and together they formed a constellation of memory around the absent sun of the Erdtree. They no longer sought to claim the throne, for they had learned the throne itself was only a shadow cast by longing. Instead, they told a tale of a city that had reached perfection and found only loneliness there. And so the legacy of the Tarnished became the mirror of Leyndell's fate. Flawed souls who carried fragments of gold through a world that had outgrown gods. Even the land remembered. From the highest cliffs, one could see the faint silhouette of the Ashen capital against the horizon, a dark bloom in the perpetual mist. At sunrise, the light caught its ruins and scattered into the air, turning the clouds above into a pale river of gold. People began to call the phenomenon the weeping sky. Farmers paused their work to watch it. Scholars bowed their heads. For those brief minutes each dawn, the world looked the way it had since the Age of Radiance. And then the gold faded, leaving only ordinary day. In that vanishing, they found comfort, a reminder that beauty could return, even if only as reflection. Generations later, pilgrim roads formed again, not to seek paradise, but to witness what had replaced it. The dust chaplain orders guided travelers through the silent streets, teaching them to walk slowly so as not to disturb the patterns the wind drew in the ash. Each ruin had a name now: the Gate of Forgiveness, the Hall of Unmaking, the Stair of Echoes. Pilgrims left offerings of soil from their homelands, mingling the earth of the outer world with the ashes of the capital. They say it was the way of binding all lands to the same truth, that nothing built by hands, divine or mortal, escapes change. The sapling at the city's heart had grown taller by then, its pale trunk streaked with veins of dull gold No one called it the Erdtree. They called it the memory, for it remembered both flame and light. When wind passed through its branches, the sound was neither hymn nor lament, but something gentler, acceptance. Every civilization that rose afterward was built with Leyndell in mind. Kings swore that their thrones would not repeat its sin of perfection. Architects left deliberate flaws in their temples, asymmetries meant to remind builders that permanence is pride disguised as faith. Even warfare changed. Generals spoke of balance rather than victory, as though the memory of the Shattering still haunted their blood. Leyndell had become the moral axis of the world, its rise a dream, its fall a warning, its ashes a teacher. And perhaps that was its truest divinity, not the golden law it once imposed, but the wisdom drawn from its absence. Deep beneath the new sapling, among the roots of the burned Erdtree, the air still hums. Travelers who sleep nearby hear voices in dreams, not words, only tone. Some awaken in tears, others in laughter. They say the sound is neither Marika nor Radagon, neither god nor ghost. It is the city itself, remembering everyone who ever lived within it. Memory has replaced grace as the breath of the world, and through that quiet pulse, Leyndell endures, no longer holy, yet never forgotten. Walk through the ruins slowly. Let your steps raise the dust that was once marble. Listen. Each grain of ash holds a story. The tree above you is not silent. It is simply speaking in a language slower than time. It says, all things rise, all things burn, all things return. The lesson is not in glory or ruin, but in the rhythm between them. That rhythm is the true heartbeat of the lands between. It began in Leyndell, beneath a golden sky, when a goddess dreamed of eternity and a warrior believed her. It continues now, in every wanderer who lifts their eyes to the ashen horizon and feels something stir, not faith, not fear, but the will to go on. For as long as someone remembers the city, for as long as one tarnished still carries its story across the plains, Leyndell lives. And so ends the tale of Leyndell, the royal capital, the city that rose higher than heaven, and learned that even heaven must one day bow to time. If you found peace in this journey through its rise and fall, let the memories stay with you a while longer. Breathe. Listen to the quiet between each heartbeat. That's the echo of the golden city, still pulsing in the ash. If you'd like more nights spent among worlds forgotten and stories that never truly end, consider leaving your light here. A like, a subscribe, a small flame added to the fire. Until next time, may grace, or whatever remains of it, guide you softly